We've got a pretty exciting panel today of biologists and field scientists. Um, I fortunately was able to, coming out of college, have my first year as a principal investigator with the engineering firm up in New Jersey. So a lot of my early career work was in Superfund and record work. And so I did a lot of subsurface investigation, a lot of science, a lot of water, a lot of chemistry work, and did a lot of independent work. And I think that that was the most exciting work I can say that I ever did as a profession. I worked in all the sectors, so I feel as though I have a kinship to folks that have been, in government jobs. Have a kinship with folks that are also independent engineers and consultants, as well as folks that are in the nonprofit area, which is where I'm at now. And so I've really been blessed to be able to move around and kind of reimagine myself as a professional scientist over the last several decades of my work. But you all are not here to hear about me. A lot of that work is a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. So let's hear from our panelists, and we can hear a little bit about their professions, about their career interests that led them to where they are now. And I guess I'll just open it up for you all to share a little bit about yourselves. Please state your name. I don't think I said mine, which is Daryl Haddock, and I'm with the West Atlanta Watershed Alliance, an environmental justice nonprofit that works in the watersheds of the city of Atlanta, in communities on the west side. And I bring you greetings from Atlanta, which are the Muskogee territories in the state of Georgia. So let's open it up. And maybe Astrid, would you mind sharing a little bit about yourself?
Oh, hi everybody. My name is Astrid Caldis. I am originally from Brazil. I've been in the United States for 25 years. I live in Maryland, in the land of the Piscataway and the Anacostan Nacotchunk Indians. And I grew up as a very nature lover. I got a degree in biology, then I got a PhD in ecology, became a field ecology for most of my life. And now I am a climate scientist. And I can tell you a little more about that during the panel. What happened and what was the trajectory? What was the trigger for the big change? Happy to be here.
Thank you. And who might you pass it to?
I'm going to pass it to Lauren.
Hi, everyone. My name's Lauren J. Bush. I use she, her pronouns, and I live in the East Bay, which is Ohlone territory. And my path to becoming a biologist is more on the engineering side. So I have a bachelor's, master's, and PhD all in biological systems engineering. And what we do is we try to understand natural systems in biology and figure out how we can use them for human benefit. So the work that I do now is I work for Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. I've also done work with Lawrence Livermore National Lab, hence my slip up. And I was studying soils to understand how the microbiome in those soils affects the plants that they live close to. So I was really interested in growing plants both for human consumption and for animal consumption and for all the different products that we need in a way that's more ecologically friendly. So I've just switched out of actually doing bench research. Now I kind of work at this strange intersection between government and scientists, where I work with scientists to hone their ideas from like a really minute, small picture to a really big picture idea that we can gather a lot of interest around for federal funding. So it's a weird place that not a lot of scientists go, but because I had a strong background in nonprofit work, I was able to make that transition. So we can also talk about that, and I'll pass it to Toby.
Thank you. I'm in Central Florida on the Atlantic coast, which is, exactly what it sounds like. And Florida, I'm from New York originally, and I'm an assistant professor of biology, specifically marine science. And specifically, I study sharks, and more through sheer stubbornness than any kind of natural ability. I feel fortunate to do this because, it's one of those things we call charismatic megafauna, sea turtles, any whales, dolphins, things like sharks. And I really love getting to do a combination of research and teaching because I'm all about variety. I just got lucky with every step that I made. I was always, since I was little, a weird person, like probably a super strange little kid, because I was always like, sharks, and other little kids are like, horses. But I just kind of did whatever I could. Anything I could get in the sciences, I would try and do, and scrubbed freezers and full of dead fish, and got to go to Oberlin College in Ohio as an undergraduate, which I loved, but which is nowhere near the ocean. Nobody knows where it came from. I sort of seemed to come like this, just liking sharks, but I loved Oberlin. And from there, I worked for a couple years in biomed because that's how life is. You got to work, sometimes. And so I took time off of my education because even though I was really stoked about what I wanted to do, I was not the best scientist, at least at first. I was not the best student, I should say. I like to think I'm a good scientist, but I wasn't so good at sitting in classrooms. I didn't get the best grades. But I was pretty stubborn and willing to get up early and work my butt off. And so I feel really fortunate to be where I am. And I was shocked when I got my first job as a professor in 2012, just to find out that I was only one of 2 women in the entire country who worked at universities, had their own lab, and studied sharks in the field. And that was kind of amazing to me because I didn't realize it was that rare. I was just doing my thing. And it turns out the other person who was that other person was no longer allowed to take graduate students because she was so abusive to them. And so I kind of just fell into being someone who didn't really look like all of the other people around me because, no penis. And so since then, I've tried to become more aware about how few women there are, and especially women of color, in my profession in general as a scientist, and specifically as a shark biologist, because what we do is so macho and not seen as a traditionally lucrative profession that we really just have a terrible lack of representation. So that's what I do.
Thank you. I think I have a little bit in common with each of you. So I guess I'll tell you a little quick story about myself, and then we'll talk a little bit about where or how each of you kind of landed where you were. So originally I'm from New Jersey, and I grew up in the late 60s, early 70s. And so back then, there weren't a lot of images of people who look like me, on TV, much less in the sciences. And so the person I gravitated towards was this real funny looking white dude that used to wear a skull cap. He used to come on PBS. He had a red Scully on, and he had his own boat, and he would scuba dive with sharks and whales. And I was like, man, this guy's getting paid, and he's living on a boat, and he's diving. And I said, I'm gonna be the first Black Jacques Cousteau. And back in the day, we all thought we was gonna be the first Black something, And so I really wanted to be a marine scientist. And so, very much like Toby, wasn't a real great student. And I was great at science because I love science, but I was not great at math. And so math was always the thing that really would always get me in most of the classes that I had. And so once I got to undergraduate, I saw differential equations in my future. and was like, there's no way I'm gonna make it through that. And so I dropped the marine science degree and became a geographer. And I've professionally been a professional geoscientist. And the blessing is that I've been able to still do a lot of my, academic work and my professional work, even with a social science degree. And it might have even helped me to have a different perspective. But that's my journey on, just where or what was the first inspiration for me to become what essentially now is a water scientist. How about you all? Would you share a little bit about kind of what were those first inspiring thoughts that led you to where you now are?
I guess I'll go first. Keep the same. So, growing up in Brazil, I always liked nature. I always liked to I wanted to know how things worked, how animals lived, how things worked in nature, loved plants, loved animals. And since early on, I wanted to become a biologist. And I was in college and I started an internship with one of the professors, and it was a ecological genetics internship. And I was in the lab all the time with fruit flies. And I was miserable. And I was like, is this what I wanted to do? Come on. Well, fast forward a little while, and I finally find field ecology. And I always worked with insects. Toby worked with charismatic megafauna. I worked with charismatic, not so mega, but not microfauna also. I worked with butterflies. So worked a lot with butterflies, got my degree and everything, and moved to the United States, always loving what I did, but an academic at heart. And finally, when I was here, I had field experiments here in Maryland with the butterflies and their natural enemies and, the things that ate them, what they ate, all those interactions, And then one year, my experiments in the field didn't work quite so well because something was amiss. And then the following year, my experiments didn't go so well again because the bugs came out too early. I didn't have the experiment set up. Then there was this big storm that washed away all this little traps that I had put on the ground for the bugs to come out of the soil. And then by the third year, I was a little, took me a while. I'm slow sometimes, but I finally realized it was climate change. Climate change was really screwing up my experiments. And that's when I decided I want to learn about climate change because, I like to know my enemy so that I can face it, So I decided to study a lot of climate science and climate change. And that didn't detract from being out in the field or from knowing about field, sciences, because climate kind of involves everything. It kind of affects everything that's around us. So I left academia and decided that I would put my knowledge to the good of the world. Sing along now. And I decided to work with policy and conservation, but all related to climate change. And that's how I am where I am now, and really, really loving my job. And I can talk a little more about that later on in the conversation. But what landed me here was first my love of nature, and then halfway through my career, not halfway because I'm old. I'm 50s. Come on. And born in the 50s, grew up in the 60s also. Okay, I'll give you that. And kind of towards after 25 years of being a professor, the realization that something needed to change, a lot so that we could kind of keep safe and sustainably in this world. So that's that. And I'll pass it on to Lauren again.
Great, thanks, Astrid. So I also was one of those, for lack of better terms, dirt kids, where you could find the kid or always sitting in the dirt. Full dirt kid growing up. And I grew up in the country. And so when I went to university at UC Davis, I started out as pre-med because that's what you did. If you were good at science and math, if you had those things going for you, you signed up as pre-med. And so I did that for a while. And then I, through those early classes, I was taking classes with hundreds of people. And I finally took a writing class for health sciences. And I realized that once these people opened their mouths, I wanted nothing to do with them. It was not for me. I was definitely much more interested in the science than in the more lucrative aspects of what health science is, right? And I think probably a lot of the biologists on this panel resonate with that, is the science is more interesting than the paycheck part, which is what motivates a lot of the folks in the medical field. So at the same time that I had that frustration, I also was getting really involved in climate activism on my campus. And those things kind of merged together, and I realized that I could use my knowledge of biological systems to hopefully help ameliorate the climate problems that we know we have, right? And so the first things that I started work on was mining compost for enzymes. So we know that we have amazing composting technologies that help us reach our zero waste goals, but one of the things that we don't often think about in those composting systems is that there's a lot of really interesting biology going on in there. So different microorganisms are breaking down woody plant material, which is something we think we could probably use for biofuels if we ever decide to go down there. But there's just a lot of really interesting biotechnology applications happening there. So I studied that for a while. I also worked on looking at algae for a potential biofuel or other bioproducts. Could we grow algae on wastewater? Spoiler, probably not. I also looked at different ways that we need to check whether or not we are making both ecological and economically good decisions. It's a process called techno-economic analysis. It's basically accounting for the earth plus people plus profit. And it's a great way to make sure that the technologies that we want to push forward are actually worth our time and effort. So I did that for biofuels, for specifically algae biofuels, and that's why you got the spoiler, because not so much. But a really interesting process, and a good way to self-evaluate and industry evaluate whether something should or shouldn't be happening. And then after, so those were all my grad school experiences. And then after that, I went and started the work where I was looking at the microbiology of soils, and developed some devices for microscopes that I eventually wrote a patent for. So those are really fun applications of the science that you don't think about, right? Like when you go into science, you don't think about the patent part, you don't think about the checkpoints along the technology way. And those things I find really interesting. During my time at the National Lab, in my postdoc, I experienced a lot of discrimination. I experienced a lot of, like my first day in the lab, my coworker who I shared an office with said, "Oh, I'm so glad that they hired a woman. The lab is really dirty and we need someone to clean it." And this was in 2018. Like, I'm not that old. This is absurd. So that made me really angry. And the way that I'm using that anger is by, so I said that I work to develop new ideas into big multi-million-dollar science programs. And so what I'm doing in that process is making sure that people understand basic diversity, equity, and inclusion ideals while they're going through that process. So as soon as their project is able to get funded, they're already set up to do science in an inclusive way. And I think that's like we have to keep putting, it's just like the techno-economic analysis. We've got to keep putting these safeguards, these checkpoints into our systems to make sure that they are equitable, because otherwise they won't be. Things will fall through the cracks. And so those are the things that really make me passionate, is making sure that we are preparing for our future, making sure that our science is inclusive, and making sure that we have enough money to do the things that we want to do, because team science is very expensive, it turns out. Okay, I'll pass it to Toby and say goodbye for right now.
Well, that's tough to follow. That really resonated with me. Thanks for sharing, Lauren, because, and Astrid too, because what you said about, wanting to make whatever you're doing as inclusive as possible is something that I see a lot. And I always feel like I'm not doing anything or enough. And I appreciate that you have found that in your journey. And I have actually worked on insects, believe it or not. And that thought made me think of something I wanted to maybe share with people who are listening, who aren't at sort of the point where we are at in our careers, who are thinking that, we kind of spring out of the womb fully formed, knowing exactly what we want to do. And of course, that's not true. And even if you do, because I kind of did a little, which is totally weird with the shark thing. Nobody knows where it came from. I'm from upstate New York. There's no oceans. But I was able to do this, basically just, work until I caught a break. We're all kind of, I think the other panelists will agree, we're all kind of faking it till we make it. And so if I take something like, I did my postdoc on bugs. So I got a lot of, after I was a pretty poor student in undergrad, I worked for a couple of years in biomed to earn money and do research. And then I applied to a whole bunch of schools and I got into grad school at the University of Hawaii. And so when I was there, I got to do all sorts of other random projects because I was like, kind of paying my way through school like we do. And so I got to work on raising native Hawaiian sea urchins in order to try and combat invasive macroalgae, invasive seaweed. So using a native organism to try and combat an invasive organism that's kind of taking over. And so I was really lucky that I got to kind of dip my hands into all of these other places where I'm just fascinated, And then after that, during my postdoc, which if you've never heard of it, is kind of the stepping stone between getting your PhD and moving on to a permanent career, and where you're kind of doing something else. And so what I ended up doing was I got a job at the University of Arizona, and I got to study giant water bugs, which are the apex predator of these little annual streams that pop up in the mountains of southern Arizona. And they're like this big, and they eat snakes and fish and turtle and birds and each other. And they're the sharks of their little world. But it was what I'd studied as my PhD was, turns out, female promiscuity in sharks. And so it was a little bit of a kind of funny way to say, turns out I got to find out with part of my dissertation that female sharks, like a lot of females in nature, mate with more than one male, and that's normal for them. And turns out I love studying reproduction from a female perspective, which hadn't really been done. So looking back on it, I can make that postdoc on bugs sound really good because these bugs have sex role reversal, kind of like seahorses, where the dad takes care of his bugs. And all the babies are living on his back and he takes care of them, and the mother just boogies on out. And so I can say, oh yeah, I got a fellowship as a postdoc to study a more theoretical model and what I'd really done in an applied model with sharks and a sex role reverse model, as opposed to a more sex role conventional model with regards to molecules and theory. Sounds good, right? I got a job. It was the only job I got, and it was on bugs and not sharks, but it was a job and I took it. And the further you go in your career, the more choice you'll have. And it seems like a straight shot, but really I think, at least for me, but probably for none of us, was it ever a straight shot. And so I know from studying something that people think are cool, which is the only reason I have a job, and I'm aware of that, and that's okay, is because I get to say things like, sharks are awesome, but they're also really important to the environment. And if we lose sharks, we're going to have this cascading, potentially devastating collapse of the world's oceans. And so, yeah, I just, if you're one of those people who, if you're envisioning a job or a career in field science, but say you like something like elephants and you want to go study elephants, don't let anybody tell you that you can't do that just because it's a fancy animal and everybody wants to study it, because you absolutely can. And, you know, everybody here is as smart as everybody else, but it takes being able to get up after you get knocked down.
Well, each of you have shared really the answer to my next question, which was, what were some of the challenges? And so each of you talked about some of those kind of really pivotal moments in your life that caused you to maybe rethink or reshape your trajectory. And so since you've already done that, I would like to ask, you know, how or what might be ways that you get to show up in a more social justice or of environmental justice way in your work. So, you know, what are ways that you're able to think about or reimagine justice through science?
Anybody want to go first this time around? Change the order a little bit? Okay. One thing that when was working as an ecologist, while I was kind of building my career, one thing that always astonished me was that humans always separated themselves from the environment. Sorry about the phone in the background. They separated from the environment. They was like, there's humans, and then, you know, there's all those plants and all those animals and everything else out there. And they're there to serve us, you know, and we can do whatever we want with them. They are there for us to use. And I never really liked what we call that anthropocentric view of nature. And the more I saw that anthropocentric view, the more I saw that it was actually a very racist and very privileged view, right, of the world. Because the only people who thought that the world was there for them to take were the people who had the means and resources to actually use that world, right? So as time passed and as my work in academia started to feel more and more a niche of just for scientists. Not that that's not important, because without the science, we don't advance anything. Science is in our everyday lives, right? Science is important for us in everything. This water bottle that I'm drinking my water, clean water, you know, all the things that we do, everything around us has science behind it. And a lot of people don't realize that. But one of the things that kind of really got to me, especially after I left academia, was the fact that not everybody was treated as a human being. So there's the other side of humanity, you know, as we saw well today. It was a human being who died last May under the knee of that police officer. You know, we have to recognize that the people in the poor parts of town, the people who do not bring so much tax income base to that city, to that community, they're people. They have to eat, they have to live, they have the rights to health, good health, clean air, clean water, food, everything else. So in my work now, one of the big focuses is environmental justice and climate justice. I go and I fight from federal level all the way to local level and inside the communities themselves to show them what power people have and how they can improve their lives and how important it is for them to improve their lives, because a lot of people just accept it and say we have no way out. And one big part of for my work is, oh no, there is a way out if we all work together, but we have to have that willpower and we have to have that, you know, that knowledge. So I try to put all these things together to try to bring up the issue of climate justice and equitable adaptation, equitable resilience, resources, equal resources for everybody, so that people who are hit like Katrina are not left behind. The wealthy people all do well after Katrina, but you know, 10 years after, there's still people just reeling from it, you know. So that's a big part of my work now, you know, that connects to that climate justice and environmental justice aspect.
Thank you. How about you, Lauren? What would you say is the way that your work touches the intersectionality of science and justice?
Yeah. So I've been publicly educated my entire life. So I went to a public school, I went to a public university. I did my graduate work on federal funds from NSF and Department of Energy. So I didn't pay for grad school. I also got funds for undergrad education. So my brain is yours. And so I have a lot of obligation, I think, to pay off that debt and to use my intellect to serve the people who made it possible for me to get here. So that's connection number one. Connection number two is I work for the Department of Energy. So the national lab system, there's 17 national labs all throughout the United States, and each one of those is tasked with different science objectives. If you don't know much about the national labs, feel free to ask me, feel free to touch base with me later on, and I can tell you all about it, because a lot of people don't know about the national labs, and a lot of really interesting research, really interesting big science team research is happening at the national labs. The national labs have also done some really shitty things. So see nuclear weapons. Number one thing, right? Like that's a really terrible thing. And as a Japanese American person, I also think that's really shitty. So I think that's the other connection, right? Is one, I feel obligated to do my absolute best at my science because I am a public servant at the core, but also I think that there's this really important thing to think about in ethics in biology and ethics in science writ large, right? And just like we shouldn't be pushing forward biofuels that don't make any sense economically or environmentally, we shouldn't be pushing forward science that is unethical to develop, right? There's needs to be some safeguards there, especially for the types of work that I'm working on, right? Like if my colleagues develop methods to, for example, like be able to do targeted removal of bacteria in soil, we want to make sure that we know what the long-term ecological consequences of that is. Because we might think it's a good idea short-term, but what are the long-term implications for that? And those sorts of questions are ones that we need to put safeguards in to make sure that we're hitting those checkpoints, because we don't know what those justice implications are. The other thing, the other connection point, and I've been really, really happy to see it, is for the very first time, the Department of Energy has a justice coordinator as part of the Department of Energy. And she is doing an amazing job so far. I am blanking on her name at this very moment, so that's very embarrassing, but I highly encourage you to look up what she's done. She just released a report on what energy justice could look like in the future, and how the communities that previously have not been served to the way that they need to be served should be served in the future. And so I think that that's a really good blueprint for, one, thinking about the different knobs that you can turn as activists and the different ways that the government is already thinking about change, and then ask them to go a step further. And with that, I'll send it to Toby.
Well, I was raised half Jewish and half hippie. And so I was raised with the notion of service and protest and social justice, and never just feel fortunate to be able to incorporate that in my profession where I can, because I'm conscious of my privilege as a white woman. Even though women are rare in my profession, I do have privilege as a white person. And so part of my job now that I get to do stuff like this, which is to talk to people and even sometimes be on TV, is to try and draw attention to the voices of women of color who are here, who are doing things. It's kind of my job to amplify those voices, and to ideally to try and be purposeful and active about it, and not just be complacent. But I just was at the right place at the right time to get some visibility as one of the only women to have a featured special on Shark Week in 2018. And I was, very excited, obviously, about the experience. But I grew up watching Shark Week, and I never saw myself as part of that, very macho profession. We're talking about being dirty, kids that play with bugs. And I was very much of a tomboy. And so it was part visibility as from the sharks, because sharks, again, they carry that visibility. And also paired with it, the opportunity to be a teacher, because I come from a long line of teaching and I love research, but I really love teaching. And I think that it's a blessing to get to talk to people who are stoked on anything, like anything at all. It doesn't have to be sharks. It's just, I love being around people who are interested and passionate. And I found myself in this place where people say, oh, wow, you were on Shark Week. And I'm like, trust me, nobody is more surprised. Like, it's like, when do they go knocking for like the middle-aged, vaguely overweight white woman, like to be on, right? But since I've been fortunate to do that, I've gotten to have people come up to me and be like, I never saw anybody like me on Shark Week. And I even have that wetsuit, and that was awesome. And so that told me that what I was doing was at least showing people a little bit of the reality of who's actually doing the science, because who's visible to the public is not who's doing the work. And so as a teacher, I get to teach people about sharks because they're so important to the environment. And without them, we've already lost most of them, 70% of them, I kid you not. And we're finding out all the time that they live for a lot. Sharks can live for hundreds of years, and they reproduce like we do. They have very few babies at a time. They take decades to grow up and even start having pups, like seriously, like 400-year-old sharks, I kid you not. And they're being lost before we can even figure out what species they are. And so the fact that I get to bring that message to people by doing what I do is something that I'm grateful for. And so I really just sort of, shoot, like I'm from Woodstock, and like I've been on Fox and Friends. Like, give me an audience and I will try to say, hey, sharks are scary, but they're also cool. Like, let me grab your attention and turn it to this crisis that we're seeing in the world's oceans. And so that's kind of my teacher, Toby, which is the same person, because talking on camera and teaching a class is the exact same thing. And getting to talk to amazing students like Liz, and kind of share my passion in that way. And then, since I've been fortunate enough to become a professor and start climbing the ranks in my profession, I get to promote other women. I get to say, I thank you so much. I love that you want to interview me, and I really appreciate it. But like, have you talked to Jasmine Graham? She founded an entire new society for Black women in shark science, and women of color, but the founders are all Black women, and they're doing this crazy cool sawfish research, which are so like I said, I feel like as someone who is white, it's not my job to talk about racism and the things that we're dealing with now to people of color. People of color know racism is a thing. I feel like it's really my job to talk to other white people, especially my students, and try to help them to see how much a part of our society is built on racism, because a lot of them don't know. And they don't know what privilege is. And they're not necessarily going to hear it from me, but maybe they will. You never know. And so, yeah, I'll turn it back to the other folks on the panel. But I just, you guys have not met me for like 5 minutes. You know exactly who I am. This is like what I just want to, share the stoke.
No, no, no. It's been excellent energy coming from everyone on the panel. So I'm actually going to switch gears a little bit and just open it up so that we get some questions from our participants for this last 10 or so minutes. And then we'll have some closing comments, hopefully, in the last few minutes before we have to close it out for the evening. So I see one question from Allie. Looks like I can read it, or Allie, you can unmute, but if you want to unmute, you could ask it yourself.
Hello. So I'm Allie. I'm a freshman in college and I'm looking to study ecology and environmental biology. Do you guys have any like tips for those of us just starting our academic and, careers?
Anybody want to take that one on? All right.
Welcome. Awesome. Congratulations. And what I like to tell people at any point in their undergraduate career is that a lot of what you're doing and you will be doing for the next 4 years is kind of the hardest part of your training. So a lot of what we do requires higher education, so master's or PhD. But the closer you get, the further you go, the more classes you tend to take that you're like super into, right? In the beginning, it's a lot of intro classes. It's a lot of work. It's not as much fun. Hang in there. It gets easier when you get closer to what you love and you get to find out what you love on the way. The other thing I wanted to tell you is that this is a marathon, not a sprint. So if you're a woman in science, at whatever stage in your career you're at, you are probably pretty hard on yourself. You're probably pretty good at what you do. You might be a perfectionist. You might be someone, who really, is the careful one. You like to help your friends find their car at the end of the night. You like to make, you might even be the oldest in your family. We see that really responsible. Your job is to take care of yourself because you are enough to do this job. You've already gotten into college. You've already done a lot of the hard part. Just know that we all kind of walk around thinking, I really hope nobody figures out that I'm not as smart as everybody else. And I'm only speaking for myself here, but I know as a woman in science that we share certain qualities. And one of those is a really amazing ability to be hard on ourselves and to beat ourselves up for not doing it right. And because I hope you've been able to see that all of the women and men on this panel come from different backgrounds. There's no wrong way to do it. It's just however you can do it. It's a marathon, not a sprint, and take care of yourself. Anxiety and depression are endemic in science, in women in particular, because we're so hard on ourselves, men as well. I'm sure I don't have that perspective. So just tell yourself, practice telling yourself that your best is enough and that you'll get there. And it's not there's no one perfect path.
I would add, don't be afraid to change your mind. Because while you are there, you may get very interested in something else, and don't be afraid. Don't just follow your gut. Do what you feel is right and what makes you happy and what excites you. Don't follow a rigid path because you set out to do it.
So also, what a year to start college, first of all. Oh my goodness. My other thought is that I've always thought that science is not really about the brains, it's about the tenacity and the unwillingness to give up. So my recommendation is maybe a little contrary to what Toby's was, is to do one thing that you don't like. Because if you don't like something and you're still making it through, then that shows a lot about your character. Obviously, don't put yourself in a place that makes you completely and entirely miserable, but think about something that you don't like doing, but you're willing to do because you know it's going to get you the thing that you want. So build that like resistance, build that fortitude in a way that's safe, so that you can do it when it maybe isn't safe.
Excellent, excellent. And I mean, I really can't even add anything to that. So I am not going to try because I've learned as a married man, don't come behind. So with that, we're going to shift in maybe. No, wait. Let's see if there's one more question because we got a little bit of time. So is there one more question out there that I feel is just burning on somebody's lips before we go out to some closing statements from the panelists?
Looks like there's a hand raised.
So go ahead and unmute and please share your feedback.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Hi, my name's Jolyn. I'm a UCR microbiology major right now. I'm in my undergrad, and I'm really interested in microbiology in the sense of pollution remediation, but I'm also interested in kind of learning more about the ecosystems they affect and things like that. I'm kind of curious as to like, what is the need, or like who's hiring for pollution remediation? I understand like it's research, but are there companies that's what they focus on? I'm just kind of curious, like, what should I be looking for when I'm looking for jobs? Also, thank you, Kaylin, in this field.
We're hiring. We do that.
Oh my gosh, what's the company's name? I'll look you up.
So
Yeah.
I don't work for a company. I work for Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, and we have undergraduate interns every year. And that's something that they're paid internships. Right now we've been doing them remotely, but we obviously do them in person during normal times. And one of the projects in particular that you might want to look at, it's called Enigma. And it is looking at trying to use microbes in the soil to remove radioactive particles. I'll put the link to their project in the chat for you.
That's amazing. Yeah, I was curious about it because like I see that like Toby likes sharks. I wanted to do it in mostly marine environments. I'm really interested in pollution in water. I'm now doing research on PFAS in water systems. And I was curious, how does pollution remediation meld into kind of ecology and just animal science or things like that? Like, will I ever get to work with people like Toby with doing pollution remediation? I grew up as a National Geographic Blue Planet obsessed kid, and I used to want to do like shark science and things like that. But then I took a microbiology class and a water treatment class, and now I want to do micro. So I'm like, how can I get the best of both worlds?
Toby, can I just jump in before you say something? I just wanted to say, I work at the intersection of activism and working with city planners and municipal governments on equitable park development. And so I would say there's a ton of nonprofits that are starting to get into this work that are really pushing ecosystem services and how to think about, making sure that the parks of the future not only just are recreational and benefit people, but they benefit nature. So I just wanted to kind of just jump in there and put a pin there. But also engineering firms are another way. There's a whole different dynamic to an engineering firm, but that work is out there too. All right, Toby, go ahead and jump in.
I was just going to say that if you're flexible with regards to geography, you might try looking on kind of the Gulf Coast, Atlantic Coast area, because due to the Deepwater Horizon oil spill and the Restore Act, there's been a huge influx of funds into that part of the world to look at bioremediation of oil spills with microbes. And I mean, don't get me wrong, I love sharks, right? But I think microbes are unbelievably awesome, and they make people like me in all sorts of scientific disciplines, because we're all just nerds of a different flavor. And kind of back to what Lauren was saying, finding things that you don't like to do is just as valuable as finding things that you do, because you learn about yourself. And so I think that however, whatever you find yourself falling in love with, that's valid. That's what happens. If I'd fallen in love with something else, I wouldn't do what I do, and I'd still count myself super lucky. So if hopefully you can find a job, and let me know if I can help at all.
So I wanted to just make sure that we spent maybe the last 5 minutes, maybe just hearing from the panelists. If you would, panelists, put your emails in the chat for everyone in case folks, if you don't mind, if you feel comfortable enough to do that. But I'm gonna stop now so we could get 5 minutes of closing comments from each of you. And then the last thing I'll say is before we close out, there's the opportunity fairs and the science and the career panels that are going to happen after this. So make sure as participants, you check out those other activities and events in the schedule. So the next voice you'll hear hopefully will be Astrid.
Sorry, I was responding to Kaylin. What did you ask me?
Just a closing statement. If anybody wants to maybe take a minute and a half each to just just close it out.
Yeah, no, my main thing is just always think of the community and always think of the environment, because everything is interconnected, right? So always ask questions, always be kind, and always think of people as part of the world. And remember, we can do a lot. We can stop climate change. We can live sustainably. We can keep the earth beautiful with all the sharks and all the bugs and everything. And our ecosystem, there's one right here. And our ecosystems functioning perfectly, if only we have the willpower, and the power only comes from people. So remember that, you know, particularly when you talk about elected officials. That's my last word. Thank you.
All right, Lauren, do you have a closing statement?
Sure. So I think that the overall message that I want to have you remember is that science is a community activity. And so one, you need to cultivate your community, in that you need to make sure that the people that need to be there are there, and that they continue to be there, and that you're supporting one another in a way that is fair for the long run. And with that, like everything else, a community can get off track. And so if you're the person that is standing up and saying things are not right, you're probably going to have to be the brave one. And that's hard, but it's really necessary as part of the broader community. So I hope that you have all really wonderful, fruitful careers in science, and look forward to welcoming you into our community.
And Toby.
Gosh, it's just hard to follow that up. It's tough to go last. What I wanted to say is everything the other speakers said, and also try to be nice to yourself. I can't say it enough. And don't be afraid to have an opinion. And it's okay to have an opinion as long as you're okay with being wrong, which we're scientists, we're wrong a lot. You got to be wrong before you can figure out what's right. And if you want to be a scientist, go for it. If anybody tells you that you can't, because that happens, they are wrong. And you don't have to be the smartest. It's all about finding the strength to keep going, because it's something that you feel like resonates with you and makes a difference. And if you're like me, think about other folks. I mean, you're here, so you're already people who think about people who are other than yourselves. And so keep that spirit through your professional life. It's going to get even busier than it is now. But service and helping other people is always worth it. And last but not least, I look forward to having all of you as colleagues at some point in your career. Make sure that you can talk to other people, not just other scientists, because it's really easy to get into your little like cool bubble where you're doing something super obscure. But for instance, I can't tell people that sharks are disappearing and that they should care about my research, because I'm trying to figure out where sharks are going with seascape genomics, where these populations are moving in regards to climate change. So if you can't talk to anybody but other scientists, then the people that need to hear these messages are not going to get them. So cultivate that love of communication, and don't be afraid to share your stoke, because you would be blown away by the people who might be listening.
Cool. That's so inspirational. I want to thank my panelists. I want to thank my participants. I want to thank everyone for joining. And remember, there's going to be the opportunity fair and the career panels that are going to precede this talk. And I hope you all continue to enjoy PowerShift.